He would later tell investigators, with a steadiness that masked how small the thing felt at first, it was the minute that gave him away. 10:47 a.m. Every Tuesday, like a church bell. Not 5 minutes earlier, not 5 minutes later. He noticed it because he began to notice small things. How his watch caught the light when he reached for his coffee. How the driveway held the ghost of an engine cooling in the afternoon. 23 years of marriage had taught Eduardo Patterson to read the quiet rhythms of their life together. He knew the cadence of the trash truck, the way Alita hummed when she balanced the ledger at night, the pattern of their children's footsteps on the stairs. This, he thought, was nothing. It was, he would discover, everything. At first, the oddity was a curiosity, the kind of little domestic mystery couples trade jokes about. 2 hours and 13 minutes, she'd say when he asked, as if it were a trivial fact like the color of a sweater. I go to the bank. I run errands. That answer was always offered in the same voice, light, deflecting, a practiced nonchalance. It fit into a life where Alita worked part-time as a bookkeeper, balanced their household checkbook with almost religious care, and kept a careful, private order to things. She had never been one for drama. She kept receipts. He had been an operations manager his whole adult life, meticulous, patient, used to patterns. So the pattern registered. A Tuesday at 10:47 became a small itch he couldn't ignore. He began to mark it in his own mind. Watch the clock. Notice when she left. Note that she returned exactly 2 hours and 13 minutes later. Note the pale blue of her cardigan on rainy days. Note how she carried the same small leather bag that never seemed to be used for anything but paperwork. Then there was March, a Tuesday morning that rearranged the ordinary. He called in sick, something simple, a fever he thought would keep him home for a day. He paced the living room, feeling guilty about taking up space on the couch while the family slept upstairs. It was an excuse that, in hindsight, had the inevitability of fable. If he had not felt so small and useless, he might not have followed. He tells it like this. He was supposed to get better that day, but instead he watched the clock until 10:47, and then, precisely when the minute hand sat at the top of the hour and the little notch on the watch case lined up with the light, he stood. He went to the car and drove. What he found at First National Bank was not a single crime scene or a loud confrontation. It was a series of ordinary gestures that, when observed through the lens of that exact minute, began to assemble into a different story. He watched Alita enter the glass doors in her familiar cardigan, the leather bag at her elbow. She moved toward a private booth in the back, where bankers and clients talk in measured voices.
A man in a navy blazer approached. Tall, the kind of wealth that pads the edges of his hands. Leon Thornton. Eduardo had seen the name on a sign in the suburbs, on a development advertisement. A man associated with properties and civic donations. Up close, he read more. A slightly aggressive handshake, a practiced smile that didn't reach the eyes. The meeting lasted the same quiet 2 hours and 13 minutes. When she left, she looked tired in a way that suggested more than long errands. Back home in the kitchen, a day's worth of ordinary stillness held them both. He held the promissory note the way someone holds a sudden thorn, careful, stunned, almost embarrassed by the simplicity of its paper. It was signed in the name of Robert Brennan, Alita's father, now deceased, $185,000. The ink had turned faint at the corners, where the paper had been folded and refolded for 2 decades. There were lines and signatures, a legal-looking clause that Eduardo could read as clearly as any of the spreadsheets he managed for a living, but the language made his stomach drop. Promises of monthly payments, late fees, terms stamped in small print that felt like a trap when read in the harsh morning light. He did not find this by accident. He found it in the place she hid things, an old cedar box beneath a stack of tax forms, next to a shoebox of family photographs. It was a private archive of love and worry, handwritten receipts, a ledger in Alita's careful hand, each one a small confession. Hundreds of slips of paper, each dated, each signed, each showing the same handwriting he knew so well. Small numbers became larger when he added them up. Monthly payments that read like $3,000, the odd cash withdrawal notched in the bank column, and an arithmetic that refused to line up. When he started to add the months, he realized the enormity of what he held. The receipts, according to his count and the meticulous dates she had recorded, showed regular payments over 20 years that, stacked together, totaled roughly $720,000 paid in cash. The promissory note still listed about $47,000 as technically owed. The gap, the math that made no sense, pierced him. 20 years of payments, cash in envelopes, hands exchanging money across privacy and shame. A mountain of receipts that suggested someone had been bleeding slowly, methodically, into a system he did not yet understand. There was no melodrama in the kitchen when he confronted her. That was part of what made it so devastating. Alita looked up from the sink as if he'd asked about dinner plans. Then she saw her face and the small box on the counter. No theatrics, only the gathering of a costume she'd perfected for years, the soft deflection, the attempt to reassure. "It was nothing," she said, voice even. "Just family debt. We were paying it off."
He wanted to ask everything at once, to demand why she had shielded him, why she had taken money from their savings, why she had gotten cash and handed it across a crooked table. Instead, he opened the ledger and began to read. The receipts were exhaustive. Some were simple handwritten slips. Paid cash, $3,000, Alita. Others were printed receipts, stamped with the name of a man he now associated with the bank, a ledger of small crimes where the legal-looking paper masked an extractive rhythm. He imagined the physical sensation of making those payments, how small bills fold into hands, how shame is carried into a bank lobby disguised as normalcy. Alita's explanation, when it came, arrived in a different register, quieter, not of excuse but of preservation. Robert Brennan owed money long before Eduardo and Alita had met, she said. The original note, $185,000, had been taken out in his name. When Robert died, the obligation did not die with him. It landed like an heirloom in Alita's lap. She had chosen, quietly and without fanfare, to shoulder it. She had taken cash from their joint accounts sometimes, other times from money she kept aside. She had gone to the bank every Tuesday, met with Mr. Thornton, and passed envelopes that looked like receipts. Her secrecy sprang not from deceit for its own sake, but from an old fear, of judgment, of losing what little dignity came with admitting defeat. There is an easy way to tell this story so it becomes a morality play. The wife hides, the husband uncovers, justice rains down. That is not what happened. Eduardo felt betrayed, yes, but beneath that raw feeling was a complicated coil of gratitude, shame, and bewilderment. She had taken on the debt as an act of love. She had hidden it as an act of protection. In the vocabulary of marriage, both acts were simultaneously noble and corrosive. He asked the obvious question, who was Leon Thornton really? She hesitated and then gave the information in small doses. Thornton had been connected to Robert Brennan's loan somehow, a figure who had shown up at meetings and whose name appeared on documents. He was the man with the navy blazer, the developer who seemed to exist in the margin between legal business and personal influence. Eduardo realized painfully that he had been present for his life, but absent for crucial chapters of Alita's past. After that morning, the house changed. The children still laughed in the yard, the dishes still piled in the sink, but the domestic soundtrack had a new and unwanted bass note, suspicion. Eduardo found himself walking the path Alita had walked for years, not to confront, but to understand. He scavenged for evidence the way someone might collect confetti after a party that had ended badly. He photographed receipts with his phone. He wrote dates in a small notebook. He sorted stacks by year. He calculated, repeatedly, the totals he could not ignore. The arithmetic stubbornly refused to make the story smaller.
$3,000 a month became a rhythm of cash that was difficult to square with the original $185,000 note. Even if the math was messy in places, the ledger suggested a vastly larger outflow than the promissory note alone would demand. There were entries that read like restructuring agreements, dates that coincided with public changes in law he had only faintly heard about. He spent nights on legal forums and obscure state pages, trying to translate a different language. Usury caps, restructuring clauses, the kind of bureaucratic syntax that feels distant until suddenly it becomes the texture of your life. One name kept coming up in his searches, Jennifer Torres, an investigator at the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. When he finally called, he felt both guilty and relieved. Guilty because he imagined Alita's reaction to being exposed. Relieved because the bureaucratic tone of government calls had a clarifying quality he desperately needed. Torres listened without drama. When Eduardo explained the receipts, the promissory note, the cash payments, she guided him through words that sounded like tools. Restructuring, voided payments, statutes tied to usury law changes around 2011. She did not promise a fast fix. She did not offer dramatic guarantees. She spoke like someone who had seen patterns before and did not confuse compassion with vengeance. According to the records and the way these restructurings were handled, Torres said, There are circumstances where payments made after a certain restructuring may be subject to refund if they were predicated on usurious terms that were later deemed unenforceable. Those were careful words. They allowed for hope without promising a legal miracle. Torres asked for copies of the receipts. She asked for the promissory note. She scheduled a meeting. That meeting was the first moment when the private ledger of Alita's life began to inch toward public accountability. Eduardo understood, in a technical way, that the legal pivot, laws that changed around 2011, and a restructuring done in 2014 might make later payments void or illegal. He also knew enough to understand he should not speak as if that change guaranteed restitution. So he compiled everything and handed it over. The paper trail, the bank stamps, the handwritten slips. Jennifer Torres put the documents into standardized folders and told him she would see what could be proved. She said quietly that the state had seen predatory lenders before, and this case, if it showed coordinated use of cash payments, misrepresentations on restructuring, and a pattern across multiple families, could be part of a larger enforcement action. When he began to look beyond his house and his ledger, the story blurred from intimate to systemic. Thornton's name connected to other complaints, small lawsuits, angry internet posts, one or two local news mentions.
Eduardo and Alita eventually learned that investigators had identified roughly 8 families whose records had similar signatures, cash payments, late fees that didn't make sense, and a pattern of restructuring after statutory changes. The receipts from other households were different in handwriting, but eerily similar in structure. It was not a single failure. It was a mechanism. In quiet moments, Eduardo imagined the scene from the other side, a room with an expensive table and precise lighting, a developer leaning forward with an envelope, encouraging the folding and refolding of money into a new arrangement. He imagined the negotiation that might have felt urgent and routine to those at the table, while for the families involved, it was a slow siphoning of dignity. He kept thinking of the small paper slips in Alita's handwriting, how each one represented a moment of private reprieve, a false yet necessary solution to an inherited problem. He learned, too, how predators hid in paperwork and etiquette. Predatory lending often performs legality, contracts, signatures, clauses. It dresses itself in the language of business and hides its bite in fine print. Restructuring, as the investigators explained, can be a legal tool used properly, or a tool used to reset the clock on abusive terms. If a lender takes advantage of borrowers who lack full legal literacy, the documents may bind a family to decades of payments that far outstrip the original loan. It is a shape of harm that is gradual, and therefore, until someone counts the receipts, invisible. As Eduardo and Alita handed over their own documents, they found an unexpected community. Other families, at first distant and guarded, began to share their own ledgers. The patterns overlapped, a name here, a phrase there. The evidence thickened. Talking to other victims revealed more than money. It revealed shared practices, cash in envelopes, meetings scheduled at odd times, receipts kept by women who carried burdens quietly. The group of families, about 8 as the investigators later reported, had variations on the same story. Some had signed similar promissory notes. Others had agreements that had been restructured in 2014, the year that, according to the state files, altered the legal status of certain payments under the post-2011 usury law environment. For Eduardo, the work of compiling evidence felt like grief work and war planning at once. He cataloged every slip, every stamped receipt, every signature. He took photos, scanned documents, made duplicate folders. He learned how to read a bank stamp the way his father had taught him to read a truck tachometer, by small marks and their consistent placement. Each copy photo was an act of defiance and also an admission that the private ledger of their life might no longer be privately manageable. There was, along the way, the practical arithmetic that refused to be polite.
If the receipts added to roughly $720,000 in total cash paid over 2 decades, and if the original note was $185,000, then what had happened in between required explanation. Investigators suggested a rough breakdown. A large portion of the amount paid after restructuring might qualify for refund under certain legal criteria. A figure near $412,000 was mentioned in internal memos as a potential returned amount under one model of analysis. These numbers were fragile, contingent on proof and negotiation, and Jennifer Torres was careful to call them what they were: estimates derived from documents and precedent, not promises. Yet even as estimates, they were enough to transform the feeling in Eduardo's chest from helplessness to purpose.
$412,000, or a similar figure, meant not only financial relief, but an official recognition that these payments were part of a pattern that deserved correction. Working with Torres meant more than handing over files. It meant learning to trust a slow legal machinery that operates in steps: proof, subpoena, negotiation. It meant accepting that some moves would be bureaucratic and that some outcomes would be tactical rather than theatrical. Eduardo, a man used to immediate operational results, found the patience both trying and necessary. For the first time in their marriage, he saw Alita not as someone hiding from failure, but as someone who had been carrying a strategy of avoidance and protection, one that now had to be unpicked with other hands. The first nights after the documents left their kitchen, the house hummed with a different anxiety. There were calls from other families. There was a message from a neighbor who had seen Mr. Thornton's car at odd hours near community meetings. There were moments when Eduardo wanted to march straight into a bank and start shouting, as if righteous anger could transform paperwork into justice. Instead, he learned to organize his fury into lists: documents to scan, witnesses to call, times to meet with Torres. He learned to be methodical again. One afternoon, while he was making a careful list of receipts by year, Alita sat with him and began to explain the smaller things he had missed. She showed him an envelope with a child's drawing tucked into the corner, a picture of a house with a $sign on the roof, the kind of domestic humor that had sustained her through 2 decades of payments. When she asked why she had kept working alone, why she hadn't told him earlier, she replied with a sentence that folded love and fear into a single confession: "I wanted to protect what we had." It was not a defense so much as a desperate fidelity to a version of family that she thought she was preserving. That answer did not settle him. It complicated him. He loved the woman who had kept them intact, but he also understood how secrecy can calcify into harm. He realized that the choice she had made, concealment as caretaking, had allowed a larger harm to grow.
It had kept not only him but a small ecosystem of families from recognizing the pattern sooner. As they prepared to face the state regulator, Eduardo felt the old certainty of his job return in a different form, no longer organizing a warehouse, but organizing a life of evidence, testimony, and trust. He also prepared himself for the public exposure that would follow. If the state pursued the case, and if accusations reached press coverage, their name would be in the ledger of public stories now. He balanced the fear of humiliation against the promise that speaking up might protect other families. The first formal interview with Torres turned out to be the first time Eduardo felt something like permission. She placed their documents into a larger file and did the work investigators do: matching dates, checking signatures, cross-referencing with public records. She explained, patiently, that the 2014 restructuring played a critical role in their argument because it could show that people were essentially forced into new contracts that took advantage of them after protections had shifted. "We can't promise outcomes," she reminded them, "but we can look for patterns and bring evidence to bear." Her language never promised a silver bullet, but it offered a procedural scaffolding that felt solid in a way personal indignation was not. Over the weeks that followed, Eduardo became adept at translating private terror into public documentation. He found more stacks of receipts in odd places: the back of a cookbook, a shoebox beneath the coat rack. He sometimes trembled when he read certain lines. Other times, anger kept him steady. He began to hear the story of Alita's sacrifice as both moving and dangerous, an individual attempt to spare the family that had inadvertently left them all more vulnerable. At times, he caught himself watching the clock at 10:47 on Tuesdays, even after the initial discovery, a reflex of a kind that turns into devotion. He knew intellectually that following Alita on that first day had been an imposition on her privacy. He also knew viscerally that it had been the hinge on which everything turned. He had traced her 2 hours and 13 minutes, not because he wanted to control her, but because he needed to understand the reality she had been living in. He had discovered that a private pattern, observed long enough, could reveal a public injustice. By the time Torres called to say she had a preliminary view of the case and that other families' documents showed strikingly similar patterns, Eduardo and Alita had reached a fragile new equilibrium. Their marriage, which had been strained by the revelation, now found an unexpected partner in shared purpose. They met late at night to compare notes, to plan how they might testify if asked, to figure out whether Alita would risk public testimony. Those discussions were not always easy. Sometimes silence spoke louder than the words they could not say. The children noticed only small changes: a different tone at dinner, fewer long walks, and they carried on with the steady resilience of kids who know their parents will sort the adult world out eventually. There were small victories that felt disproportionate: a letter from the bank acknowledging receipt of the investigation, a call from an elderly neighbor who confessed she had been paying similar amounts for years and wanted to know if someone could help. There were also moments that felt like defeats, days when the state's process slowed, when subpoenas were delayed, when bureaucratic language turned hope into endurance. Through it all, Eduardo learned to be patient in a way his job had not required. He learned to trust the slow accretion of evidence. And yet, the threat of retaliation lingered in the periphery. He had read enough about predatory practices to know that exposure sometimes provoked desperate acts. He had not expected, at first, that a man with a reputation and assets might respond with intimidation rather than negotiation. But the more they prepared the case, the more he sensed the possibility that Thornton, or his associates, would not sit quietly while the state rummaged through the financial corners that had enriched him. One clear morning, after a long few weeks of paperwork and interviews, a neighbor called to say a car that matched the plate seen near the bank had been parked 2 streets over. It was the first time the abstract fear took on a shape. A car like the one he'd seen at First National, an engine idling, the shadow of an observer. Eduardo drove by and counted breaths until he was away from it. He knew social pressure could be weaponized. He knew how reputation mattered. He knew, too, that the plan ahead would require courage of a different sort, the sort Alita had shown for 20 years without recognition. They performed small private acts to steel themselves. Alita practiced what she might say if a lawyer asked her to recount years of payments in open court. Eduardo rehearsed the explanations of his own curiosity, how a minute on the clock had become a map. They photographed receipts until the pixels blurred. They saved duplicates and sent copies to trusted friends. They did not yet know whether the case would lead to a courtroom, a settlement, or a mediated restitution. They only knew that they would not allow those 20 years of payments to be dismissed as an unfortunate quirk of fate. A month after the first meeting with Torres, Eduardo read in a dry, formal email that investigators had identified other victims whose records matched the pattern. The phrase "other victims" landed with gravity. It was not a blockbuster headline, but a bureaucratic fact with moral weight. 8 families, the memo said, had documents that suggested similar extraction. Some had signed promissory notes, others had been reshaped by a 2014 restructuring.
All had, in different ways, been paying into a machine that looked like business but felt like a siphon. It is important in a story like this to resist the temptation to mythologize the antagonist. Leon Thornton was, in the files, a developer with an eye for deals. He was not a cartoon villain, and the investigators did not cast him as one. They treated him as a subject of inquiry, someone whose business practices required scrutiny. Eduardo's anger toward Thornton was tempered by the sober realization that the law looks for proof, not moral indignation. That is why, in the early days of building the case, the work felt like both a moral crusade and a long accounting exercise. By the time they were ready to move from collection to confrontation, the house felt both smaller and more resilient. Papers that had once represented shame were now materials of a fight. Friends who had once been outsiders were now counsel and witnesses. The neighborhood had the usual indifferent buzz, but within Eduardo and Alita's home, a different current flowed. The current of people who discovered that secrecy, when named and shared, could be transmuted into accountability. They did not yet know how the legal story would unfold. The law's machinery is not linear. It requires patience, the right evidence, and sometimes the courage to accept repair rather than retribution. But for Eduardo, the act that had started it, standing outside a bank at 10:47 a.m. on a sick day, remained central. It was an action that had pierced a protective secrecy, and in doing so revealed both the depth of Alita's sacrifice and the scale of a possible injustice. He had followed her not because he distrusted her, but because his husbandly curiosity had evolved into a responsibility he could no longer ignore. When Jennifer Torres told them she wanted to bring in other agencies if the documents lined up, regulatory partners, possibly even federal contacts, Eduardo felt the world tilt. The case was moving from the private to the institutional. It was moving toward the possibility of restitution, of official recognition, of systemic exposure. He kept thinking of the numbers: $185,000, the original note; $3,000, the figure repeated in so many entries; $720,000, the rough total of cash paid; $47,000, the balance still listed as owed; and the hovering estimate, around $412,000, that suggested a slice of what might be returned under certain conditions. Those numbers were not talismans. They were facts that could be used to stitch a wrong toward repair. At the end of one long, sleepless week filled with document scans and phone calls, Eduardo and Alita sat at the same kitchen table where he had first unfolded the promissory note. They held hands in the middle of a pile of paper. It was for both of them the first real moment of shared strategy in years.
She looked at him,
and for a second the severity left her face, and what remained was the woman who had signed birthday cards and made soup for sick neighbors. He squeezed her fingers, and awkwardly said what he had not said in months. "Thank you." She squeezed back and laughed once, a short, surprised sound that made him feel like maybe the marriage could bend without breaking. If you like investigative stories like this, subscribe. The files they had gathered would not close the case on their own. They would be the basis for interviews, subpoenas, and, if necessary, testimony. Eduardo knew the path ahead required more than courage. It required allies. They had found one in Jennifer Torres, and in the naming of other families, they had begun to assemble what the law calls a pattern. He also understood, with a kind of professional resignation, that patterns invite pushback. If a case reaches the point of public exposure, the subject of investigation often responds with lawyered statements, deflection, or the quiet removal of incriminating documents. On a late spring afternoon, while the children were at a friend's house and the sun slanted through the ledger pages like filigree, Eduardo made a choice he had not known he could make. He would not let the past remain a secret under their roof. He would not let Alita continue to shoulder, alone, the consequences of a system that had taken advantage of people who trusted their paperwork. He drafted an email to the other families who had come forward, a short, careful message offering to coordinate meetings and share what they had learned. He attached scanned copies of selected receipts and a spec sheet that summarized dates and amounts. He closed the email and paused, feeling the weird, trembling thrill of someone who is about to turn private grief into collective action. The responses came slowly, then all at once. Someone offering a stack of receipts from 2003, another family describing a similar meeting with Thornton years ago, an elderly woman asking whether anyone else had been told they couldn't get a copy of their paperwork without a fee. Every reply was a small confirmation that their case was not unique. Each new document strengthened the architecture of a potential complaint. It was messy, emotional, and profoundly human. Then, in a late-night phone call that closed the week, Jennifer Torres spoke plainly. If these patterns hold across the other families, and if Thornton's interactions can be shown to rely on restructurings that took advantage of statutory loopholes, there is an enforcement path we can pursue, she said. You should be prepared to testify about the receipts and the cash payments. We may ask Alita to be a cooperating witness. Her voice was steady, professional. Her words opened a door that would lead to strategy sessions, legal preparations, and hard moral choices about going public and exposing family intimacies. Alita listened in silence. Her hand found Eduardo's across the pile of papers. She had lived most of her adult life with the weight of a debt she had tried to minimize. Now that weight lifted slightly, replaced by the weight of public scrutiny. It was a different gravity, one that could lead to repair, but would also demand the exposure of private details. She drew breath, then nodded. They had begun as two people with a secret between them. They were moving into the role of witnesses for a larger story, a story about how ordinary paperwork can become a structure of harm, and how small acts of concealment, intended to protect, can entrench larger injustices. The choice to cooperate with the investigator did not undo the years of payments, but it reframed those years as evidence rather than shame. It opened the possibility of restitution and of turning their private loss into public remedy. Still, as the folder on the dining table grew thicker and the names of other families appeared in the margin of their files, Eduardo felt the slow creep of risk. He had watched vendors in his past careers hide small defects until they grew unbearable. He had seen organizations resist transparency because it exposed costs. He knew people with power did not easily cede advantage. He also knew that the first real test of their new plan would demand courage in a formal register, recorded statements, sworn testimony, the willingness to walk into a room and recount 20 years of private sacrifices. They prepared in practical ways, copying files, scheduling a recorded interview with the state, and agreeing on what Alita would say if asked about the first meeting with Thornton. They practiced her tone, the factual cadence that avoids melodrama and sticks to specifics. It was the legal version of telling a life story, short sentences, dates, documents as anchors. They rehearsed not to stage a performance, but to make sure the facts, when laid out simply, could withstand cross-examination. By the time they were ready to sit for the recorded interview, the private ledger of their home had become a dossier. The documents were no longer just pieces of paper, they were potential instruments of restoration.
Eduardo, who had followed a minute on his watch into this maze, understood the irony. His act of curiosity had opened a doorway to public accountability that neither he nor Alita had sought originally. He had thought the truth, once found, would be a private reckoning. Instead, it had become a project with communal stakes. Sitting across from Jennifer Suarez in a small windowed office, Eduardo and Alita felt the legal system moving with its deliberate bureaucratic steps. Torres paused only to read parts of the documents, and with a careful hand to note lines of inquiry. She reminded them again that process is not promise. Then she asked clearly and kindly whether Alita would be willing to help build a case against the practices she had been caught in. Alita's answer was not instantaneous.
She counted the cost in her head, the exposure, the possibility of being judged, the relief of restitution. She also thought of neighbors who might be saved from similar long-term extraction if someone named the method by which they had been harmed. She thought of her children's future and the fragile dignity of a family who had been quietly surviving. Finally, she said yes. When she said it, the room seemed to align. The case had a cooperating witness. The evidence had a narrator. The state had a procedural partner. It was a milestone without fanfare. It was, in its quiet measure, a turning point. They left the office with a plan to collect more testimony and to keep working with other families. Eduardo felt the tension of the weeks ahead, the interviews, the potential for intimidation, the likelihood that a man like Thornton would have lawyers ready. But he also felt a buoyant steadiness, the sense that the small act that began as suspicion had now rippled into a fight for something larger than their own balance sheet. And still, as they drove home that afternoon, the watch on Eduardo's wrist clicked past 10:47, an echo of the moment that started it all. He had followed his wife to the bank on a sick day, and in doing so, had stumbled into a secret that had hidden in plain sight for 2 decades. That secret had cost them money, sleep, and years of unspoken burden. But it had also, finally, been named. The naming was the beginning of a new phase, one that would require courage at different registers, legal, emotional, and communal. The papers on their kitchen table were evidence. The next steps, he knew, would demand a willingness to be visible in a way they had not been. They drove home with an odd mixture of exhaustion and clarity, the kind that comes after making a private thing public. The kitchen table, piled high with folders, seemed suddenly less like evidence and more like a map. For the first time in years, the receipts were not just a confession folded into envelopes. They were materials that might return money, restore dignity, and if they were lucky, stop the machine that had been feeding on quiet households. But the world outside their framed kitchen pictures did not pause to admire the moral architecture of their courage. The first blow came small and intimate, a lock that refused to turn one evening when Eduardo came home a little earlier than usual. The front door stuck as if someone had shoved a shoe behind it. He pushed hard, felt the give of warped wood, and then the door popped open with a sound that made his chest empty. Inside, drawers were half open, a photo album lay face down. He walked through rooms in a slow, shocked circle until he reached the hallway closet. The shoebox he had used as a second repository for copies of receipts, the one he had thought of as redundant, was gone. It was not the theft itself that stunned him first. It was the thought of those small slips of paper in someone else's hands. Those handwritten notes were more than money. They were testimony, context, the difference between a story and a conviction. Without them, their case might wobble. He called Alita from the doorway, and her voice, steady, then breaking, pulled him back into the room. She was calm in the way people force themselves to be when they want to stop panic from multiplying. They called Torres immediately. Jennifer Torres listened, then said what she always said when facts were dangerous and needed containment. Document everything. Don't touch anything further. We'll come by. Her tone suggested a practical triage. An investigator knows how to turn panic into procedure, how to convert fear into the habit of continuity. She directed them to photograph the scene, to get a police report, and to avoid confronting neighbors. She also said something that felt to Eduardo and Alita like a confirmation. The theft could be more than intimidation. It could be a targeted effort to disrupt the evidence trail. Police came, took statements,
lifted fingerprints, and left with a professional quiet. Eduardo sat on the kitchen chair and watched the sun slice through the paper pile as if it could reveal fingerprints of truth in the light. He tried to name the feeling in his chest. Violation, yes, but also a small, sharpened clarity, the realization that they had touched something that mattered enough for someone to try to stop them. The break-in hardened the state's interest. Torres told them that the theft, combined with the patterns shown in the other family's files, suggested not only predation, but active resistance to accountability. That resistance reframed the case. What had been, in essence, a civil pattern of exploitation now carried a more volatile quality. Eduardo's initial instinct was to rage, at Thornton, at the audacity, but Torres insisted they use the theft strategically. "It strengthens the narrative that someone was trying to conceal documents," she said. "It gives us probable cause to ask for more aggressive measures." Those words carried teeth and gave Eduardo the feeling that the state might move faster, that the work could be protected, at least for now. Even as they shored up their evidence, rescanning documents, calling the other families to confirm copies, sending duplicate files to safe deposit boxes, fear lingered like a weather forecast. Alita found herself replaying every Tuesday morning in her head, wondering whether anyone had watched her for years. The idea that her quiet acts of protection had made her vulnerable to surveillance felt absurd and cruel. What had been a ritual of safeguarding now read like a blueprint for extraction. Torres and her team moved cautiously but decisively.
They assembled a plan that felt like a surgical strike rather than a cinematic ambush. Get more witness statements, secure corroborating receipts from other families, and, crucially, create an opportunity for Alita to record Thornton without creating a dangerous confrontation. Their goal was not to entrap, but to collect a voluntary admission that would tie Thornton directly to specific transactions and to conduct that suggested wrongdoing. The investigators explained the ethics and the necessity in plain language. Recorded statements, properly obtained, avoid the he said, she said that predatory lenders often rely on. There was one place Eduardo dreaded, and at the same time quietly understood would be decisive: a public, neutral location where Thornton would feel comfortable enough to speak candidly. Oakwood Park fit the profile, an unassuming strip of shops with a coffee place and a bank branch, a place where deals happen because people assume they are ordinary. Torres proposed a meeting there, in a small nearby cafe. Thornton liked Oakwood Park for precisely the same reason he had liked the bank booth for Alita: it projected normalcy. The emotional work of the coming weeks was immense. Alita had to prepare to wear a wire, to speak with the cool clarity of someone under oath. That sounded easy in a transcript, but it wasn't reality in intimate violence. To narrate 2 decades of private labor in a cadence that would not ignite pity or be dismissed as hysteria. Eduardo saw the night she rehearsed: short, factual sentences, dates tucked like safety bolts, names recited without editorializing. They practiced together until the language felt like armor, not like a performance. Eduardo's role shifted again. Where once his curiosity had been a private probe done on a sick day, it became an active logistical part of a law enforcement operation. He coordinated with Torres on practicalities: where they would sit, how Torres's team would be staged nearby, who would be in the coffee shop as a backup. He learned to check his own breath, to hold still when the present felt like a cliff. There were moments he felt shame for having followed his wife in the first place. Other moments he felt gratitude that his small intrusive act had begun something larger. It was a complicated ledger of emotions. The day at Oakwood Park came with stubbornly ordinary weather, a crisp morning that made scarves practical and shifted conversation into warm cups. Thornton arrived early, as the kind of man who keeps his clock tidy. He wore his blazer and a watch with a face the size of a coin. Eduardo watched him approach the table where Alita sat, calm and composed in a coat she'd chosen because it made her feel invisible, while still being practical. The wire was a thin, almost weightless thing under her collar, an apparatus of truth that would allow the state to hear what he had been doing for years. They ordered coffee.
Thornton's voice was affable enough to disarm, polished and casual, a practiced cadence that made ordinary business sound like friendship. At first, he spoke in generalities: how he had helped families restructure loans, how difficult the economic climate had been in certain years. He used phrases that seemed meant to normalize the transactions, reworking terms, finding solutions, mutual agreements. Eduardo sat near enough to see the small betrayals of body language: a tilt of jaw, hands that gestured like an owner of things, the habit of using diminutives when he wanted to minimize significance. It was what came next that would matter. Torres had coached Alita on an approach that invited Thornton to explain, to over-explain, and ideally to authenticate transactions he had orchestrated. Her questions were measured. She allowed him to talk.
He responded with the kind of candor that seemed casual at first, and then, as the minutes accumulated, sharpened into specificity. He described meetings, the exchange of cash and envelopes, the use of restructurings to extend relief for borrowers who were behind. He spoke of receipts and ledgers, not as crimes but as paperwork that kept a business moving. At one point, Thornton made a comment, an offhand sentence that read for the investigators like a self-incriminating slip. He talked about covering past balances by resetting terms, about the necessity of accepting cash to avoid banks' paperwork. His voice carried the practical tone of someone explaining bookkeeping to a junior partner. Because the recorder was live and because Torres had orchestrated the call for precisely this reason, those words became part of an evidentiary chain. He spoke about specific sums, dates, and the idea that certain payments were moved rather than credited in a conventional ledger. The cafe felt small, and the air near their table tightened. Eduardo watched Alita's face as she asked a quiet follow-up question, simple, direct, and Thornton's response edged into a fuller admission. He described putting receipts in envelopes, asking clients for cash because cash was cleaner, and re-signing agreements in ways that gave the business leverage. When he attempted for a moment to intimidate, lowering his voice, mentioning reputations and the trouble that public exposure might bring, he did so in the presence of a live recorder. That attempt at coercion became, on the recording, a tangible piece of evidence rather than an empty threat. As Thornton grew careless, Torres's backup team, staged in unremarkable cars and taking notes from a distance, moved in. The transition was clinical. Officers approached and identified themselves. They informed Thornton that he was being detained for questioning. He protested in the way men of his profile often protest, elaborate indignation that reads like damage control.
The officers had the recorded statements, the bank stamps, the matching receipts from other homes, and the context of the break-in. Thornton's protestations deflated with the realism of evidence. He was led away without theatrics. The arrest was not a triumphal spectacle, but the necessary consequence of a procedure that had been built on documentation, patient coordination, and the courage of a woman who chose to speak. In the days that followed, news filtered in measured doses. There were official statements about an enforcement action and a local paper's small headline that made the case public. Thornton's lawyers released a terse comment about cooperation and context. The state filed charges related to regulatory violations, and there were whispers that a broader settlement might be negotiated rather than a trial. Torres reminded Eduardo and Alita repeatedly not to read the press too closely. The legal process would move according to proofs, not headlines. There was one more harsh twist. More receipts, obtained by investigators, revealed attempts to interfere with evidence, piles of paper that had been removed from family homes, documents that seemed to have been taken in the same period when the Patterson house had been targeted. The story of the break-ins added a new layer to the narrative. If someone had tried to remove proof, that suggested not only wrongdoing, but awareness that exposure could be costly. For the prosecutors, those details created a richer pattern of intent. For the families, they were another wound. The legal path presented a fork, a public trial with the possibility of extended litigation versus a negotiated settlement that could return funds more quickly to victims. Eduardo, Alita, and the other families faced the moral calculus that often comes with seeking justice, the desire to see accountability fully aired in court against the pragmatic need for restitution that could repair immediate harm. Jennifer Torres and state attorneys were blunt about trade-offs. Trials are long and uncertain. Settlements provide immediate relief but sometimes contain limitations. In the end, the decision was practical. Thornton's legal team opened negotiations. The state, with the weight of compiled evidence and the cooperation of multiple families, had a strong hand. The proposal that emerged was, according to the reports given to the families, a plea and settlement package, surrender of certain licenses tied to Thornton's financial operations, a fine, and restitution to affected families. The amount discussed in public documents and in conversations with investigators landed in a neighborhood of figures that had been floated earlier in private analyses. Alita was to receive a direct deposit amounting to roughly $459,000, an outcome that, while not an exact guarantee for every case, represented a lifeline for the families involved.
Torres remained careful to qualify every number as contingent on the formal agreements, language that felt bureaucratic but was necessary. The $412,000 figure they had seen in internal memos had been an initial projection tied to one model of calculating refunds. The approximately $459,000 that reached Alita's account after negotiations represented the aggregate of individual calculations, legal compromises, and practical decisions about how to distribute recovered assets. For Eduardo and Alita, the numbers did not erase the emotional cost of 2 decades of payments. They did, however, create a practical margin for repair. When the direct deposit hit Alita's account, the event was both anticlimactic and transformative. They were at the table again, the same one where the promissory note had first unnerved Eduardo, and an electronic notification blinked into being. Funds transferred. She stared at the laptop screen as if it could speak. The kids wandered in, drawn by the low drama of normal family life. They saw their parents exchange a look that was equal parts relief and disbelief. The money allowed immediate, tangible changes. Past due accounts that had hung like a dark cloud were settled. They paid down lingering obligations that had accumulated in the shadow of those years of secret payments. They set aside a portion to ensure the kids' future. But they did something else too. They seeded a promise. Eduardo and Alita, together, used part of the recovered funds to create a small nonprofit endowment, what would become the Brennan Foundation for Financial Justice, named for her father, Robert Brennan, to honor the fact that the debt had begun in his life and affected their family across generations. The foundation's mission in its early iterations was practical and narrow: offer financial counseling to households who had been ensnared by predatory practices, assist families in accessing records and legal advice, and fund small emergency grants that would prevent immediate crises, evictions, utility shutoffs, or the sale of essential assets. They were cautious not to promise sweeping legal victories. The foundation's role was remedial and community-focused. In meetings with other families and community leaders, Eduardo emphasized a lesson he had come to hold: exposure and support can be an engine of recovery, but structural change requires policy attention beyond any single settlement. Publicly, their story became a cautionary tale and a model of advocacy. Local reporters covered the arrest and the restitution. Consumer advocates quoted the case as an example of how predatory terms can persist under the guise of normal business. The Pattersons participated in a couple of interviews, always careful to center the victims and the practical need for reform. Eduardo, once reticent about the spotlight, found a new voice.
He spoke at community centers, in meetings, and at small panels about the practical work of collecting evidence of how a household ledger can be an instrument of both harm and justice. He did not position himself as a hero. Instead, he emphasized the collective action that had been necessary to force accountability. The family's private repair was slower and less linear than the media moments suggested. Money does not heal all wounds. It opens doors that were shuttered, but it does not erase 20 years of secrecy and the complicated mix of gratitude and resentment that followed. Therapy helped. A therapist who specialized in trauma and secrecy, who could sit with the paradox that Alita's secrecy had derived from love. She and Eduardo walked into counseling with a willingness to be vulnerable. They learned new patterns of conversation, the discipline of naming money in meetings rather than letting it calcify into the unspoken. They had to rebuild trust not as a single event, but as the accumulation of choices: transparency about account balances, shared decisions about financial planning, weekly check-ins where money was discussed with the same mild ritual as trash day. There were quiet personal consequences, too, that no external settlement could address. Alita, who had carried the burden for 2 decades, found herself having to accept apologies she had not asked for, and forgiveness she sometimes felt reluctant to grant. Eduardo had to reckon with his initial invasion of her privacy, a sick day following that, by his admission, had been both an intrusion and an act that opened room for repair. They spoke about boundaries and the ways that secrecy can both protect and harm. They practiced the awkward gratitude of a marriage that had nearly broken under the weight of a secret, but had found, through exposure, a new ground of mutual aid. The Brennan Foundation grew slowly. At first, it was a mailbox and a website and a few small grants to families in the immediate orbit of Thornton's activities. Then it became a place where survivors could come ask questions about paperwork, find vetted counselors, and apply for emergency relief. Alita chaired some of the early meetings, her voice measured and personal. She found a strange, paradoxical relief in turning the ledger of her private shame into an instrument that could help other families. The work was not an emancipation from the past, but a deliberate use of it, a transformation that carried its own kind of dignity. Eduardo, too, shifted roles. In his work life, he had been an operations manager concerned with efficiency and reliability. Now he applied those skills to community organizing, coordinating meetings, standardizing intake forms for the foundation, and teaching other families how to document transactions in ways that could serve them in court or in regulatory hearings. He was careful, always, to emphasize that his was not a blueprint for vigilantism.
The law does the heavy lifting in terms of accountability. Private action is valuable only insofar as it supports public process. There were awkward public moments. Thornton's surrender of his license and the terms of his settlement were meant to remove his ability to operate in the same way. He paid fines and, in public filings, agreed to comply with certain restrictions. His financial empire began to shrink as partners and vendors stepped back. The moral satisfaction of seeing a name reduced in size on a signboard is limited.
The practical import, that families had funds returned, that the lender could no longer offer the same products, was where justice nested for the Pattersons. Over time, the foundation began to host workshops on reading contracts, on recognizing red flags in lending, on organizing community evidence. Other victims contributed their own expertise. A retired paralegal who taught families how to request copies of documents legally, a former banker who spoke about ordinary red tape and the ways predatory lenders exploit it. The group never promised legal miracles. Instead, it sought to reduce isolation. Its message was straightforward. Secrecy amplifies harm, shared documentation shrinks it. There were legal ripples beyond the family's individual settlements. State regulators used the case to sharpen their own guidance on restructurings and to remind consumers of protections that existed on paper even if they weren't always enforced. The case became a citation in policy discussions and a reference point for other jurisdictions grappling with similar complaints. Those conversations were not always neat. Regulatory change moves at the speed of consensus and political appetite. But the Pattersons' work had created a concrete example that advocates could use when they argued for clearer oversight. At home, life slowly regained its ordinary hues. The children returned to weekend soccer matches and middle school recitals. There were vacations scheduled, small, careful escapes that felt both celebratory and pragmatic. Eduardo and Alita took a trip with the kids to a lakeside cabin. No grand gestures, just the quiet recalibration of a family that had been pulled through a difficult season. They ate grilled fish, watched the kids skip stones, and let the lake's surface do the work of steadying their nerves. At night, sitting on the porch, they spoke about the future in the simple currency of plans. College funds, a roof repair, a rotating savings plan that would be jointly managed and fully disclosed at dinner. The foundation's name, Brennan, stood not only for a man who had owed a debt, but for the tangled way obligations pass through families. They named the nonprofit for Robert Brennan as an act of memory and responsibility. Some in the community questioned the choice. Why name the charity after the person whose debt had sparked the harm? For Eduardo and Alita, it was a reclamation.
Naming the foundation Brennan was an acknowledgement that responsibility has lineage. It was a refusal to let shame be the only inheritance. There were difficult legal aftershocks. Thornton's lawyers filed motions. There were hearings about the terms of the settlement. There were technical disputes over calculation methods. Torres and her colleagues navigated those currents with the steadiness that comes from institutional practice. The families were asked to produce affidavits, to answer questions in public hearings, and sometimes to sit through cross-examinations. Those moments were hard, but they were also the precise mechanism by which private harm became public record. The very thing that had once been held in secret, the slips of paper, the receipts folded into wallets, was now a part of the legal archive. In time, the Pattersons began to hear from other families in nearby counties who recognized similarities in their own experiences. Some sought assistance from the Brennan Foundation. Others simply wanted to tell their story. Each narrative added nuance to the emerging understanding. Predatory practices are not always visible in a single contract, but can be cumulative, a slow erosion disguised as ordinary bookkeeping. The Foundation's small grants prevented evictions, paid down delinquent utility bills, and paid for counseling sessions. Those practical acts were modest in the scope of policy debates, but enormous in their human effects. Eduardo's life changed in quieter ways too. He no longer stared at his watch at 10:47 with the same exacting intensity. The time remained a marker, a mnemonic for the day that began it all, but it no longer governed his posture toward his wife. Where suspicion had once lurked, there was, imperfectly, a rebuilding of trust. They developed a ritual. Every Tuesday evening, after the children had gone to bed, they set aside 15 minutes, no devices, to speak about money, about fears, and about gratitude. The ritual was not a cure, it was a practice of candor. Alita, who had carried years of quiet, discovered a new rhythm between privacy and advocacy. She continued to do small bookkeeping for local clients and began volunteering for the Foundation's intake nights. Sitting with women in church basements or community centers, she listened to their stories and in return taught them the small arts of documentation that had once saved her name from being lost entirely. Her voice, which had been muffled by fear, found a steadier register when it was used to help others. There were legal lessons embedded in the Patterson story that people took up differently.
Some called for policy changes. Others sought to simply strengthen community knowledge. The foundation partnered with a few local legal clinics to provide pro bono advice, and with a community college to teach basic financial literacy.
These were small instruments of prevention, not cures for structural inequality, but practical ways to reduce the chance that another family would be humiliated into secrecy. Looking back after a couple of years, Eduardo sometimes measured the arc of their lives with a quiet astonishment. What began with the exactitude of a minute on a watch had become, through patient work and alliance, a platform that returned money, created mechanisms of support, and brought a predator's practices into daylight. He did not take credit so much as he accepted responsibility, the responsibility to follow curiosity when curiosity threatened to become indifference, the responsibility to turn private discovery into public good. There were days when he still felt raw. There were nights when the stain of intrusion returned, when the memory of envelopes passing hands in dim booths made his stomach twist. But those moments were absorbed into a larger frame, a frame that included restituted funds, a small but growing nonprofit, and a community less willing to tolerate quiet extraction. The Pattersons, married 23 years, tested and not unbroken, had learned that secrecy can be a form of love, but it can also become a mechanism that allows abuse to perpetuate. The answer, they discovered, was not only exposure, but organized compassion. At a small community event to mark the Foundation's first anniversary, Alita spoke simply. She said she had once believed that silence would protect her family. She had learned that silence can sometimes protect the abuser more than the protected. Eduardo stood in the crowd and watched friendships form. Neighbors who had once been polite now offering to volunteer, local churches pledging meeting spaces. The room felt like a repaired net, full of holes mended by hands that had found one another. The case's legal and financial aftermath was, in the end, a mixture of closures and ongoing work. Thornton's professional license was surrendered as part of the negotiated resolution, and restitution payments were made to the families involved. The figures reported in their account statements and public filings reflected negotiated compromises rather than dramatic judicial pronouncements. The focus shifted, at least in the Pattersons' lives, from the drama of the arrest to the quieter work of rebuilding. When the family finally took a longer trip, driving to a small coastal town and renting a modest house with a porch that faced the water, they let themselves be ordinary for a week. They played cards at night, cooked simple meals, and taught the kids how to fish from a rocky jetty. On the drive back, Alita fell asleep with her head against Eduardo's shoulder, the hum of the car matching the soft rhythm of her breath. He thought of the 2 decades she had carried alone, of the receipts folded in shoeboxes, of the morning a sick day had become a turning point. He thought of the awkward, halting gratitude they had begun to exchange.
The Brennan Foundation continued, quietly, doing what small organizations do, balancing spreadsheets, returning calls, applying for grants, and deciding which families to help next. The work was a daily grind of good intentions and logistical realities. It was not the sweeping reform some commentators are hoped for, nor was it a simple personal catharsis. It was, rather, the practical outworking of a family's decision to use restitution not only to repair their own harm, but to protect others. In the end, the story was less about the man who lost a license, and more about the lives that were steadied when private harm was made public. Eduardo kept his watch in a drawer now, not out of superstition, but as a quiet reminder of time's power to reveal. He sometimes took it out and set it to the exact minute, 10:47, muted and unadorned. He thought of how fragile ordinary life is, how easily small things can be weaponized, and how the decision to turn a private discovery into communal action can transform that fragility. If this story has stayed with you, like and share. Tell us in the comments what you would do if you found a pattern like this in your own life.